we're always pretty fascinated by female, prisoners, in particular killers. And Charlotte Mulhall has been somebody who, even though she's 18 years in prison, she's rarely been out of the headlines. She's an intriguing character. She, of course, was convicted of murder of her mother's partner, Farah Swaleh Noor, and her sister, Linda, was convicted of manslaughter, has served her sentence and is out. They were kind of tragic, the two of them, and their story was tragic, albeit they did, carry out a horrific killing and dismemberment of a man, and they kind of got away with it for a bit before conscience got the better, really, of Linda. But I always felt sort of sorry for them because they had a hard upbringing. The circumstances of the murder were very tragic. And their mother, they were sort of trying to protect.
Kathleen Ward.
Kathleen, she didn't do a huge amount of time and sort of had her freedom very quickly. But anyway, Charlotte, you were writing about her because she's had a day's outing pending her.
Well, I suppose,
upcoming release, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's all, any lifer gets this kind of a chance to kind of go out on day release, and and it's a way of reintroducing them back to the real world, I suppose. So it's not a big surprise. Unfortunately for women serving life, there isn't an open prison. They're either in the Docus or Limerick prison.
There's no section in any of the open prisons for them.
No. So, I mean, there's no question of them being, in Shelton Abbey or Locken House.
And if she was a man and 18 years served, would she be?
I would imagine, quite possibly, she would have been in an open prison at this stage. Like, it is a long time. She's most of the time she's the longest serving prisoner, because there is another prisoner who was sentenced in 1993. Who has been released several times. I think in one release in 2011, this other prisoner, Deborah Hannon, who's from Limerick, she keeps getting into trouble, and then her license is revoked, which happens with any lifer. When they're released from prison, they're still on license, so they can be recalled at any time.
What did she do, Deborah Hannon?
And she was involved in it, and it was a case, and I think she was only she was a teenager at the time, and another lady, 26, and they attacked a 17-year-old that they somehow blamed for her father's death. Her father was killed, and they somehow blamed her for it, and kind of there was a premeditated knife attack, and badly cut her up, and talked about, I think they slashed her face, the victim's face, and so on. So it was a pretty gruesome killing.
She's in her late 50s, is she?
She could well be. I'm not going to help you out because I'll just get it wrong as well. My maths brain is on strike. But yeah, no. So Charlotte's been getting these days out. I suppose what was unusual with this one was that, when you consider the horrific nature of the killing, she went to the cinema to see Aliens Romulus, I suppose, which is kind of described by one critic as a gruesome horror sci-fi flick. And then when the rain had stopped, went to the Cratloe Woods for a walk, which of course, I knew you were going to say that, because when you or I or any other involved in crime stories hear Cratloe Woods, we don't think of a place to go for a walk. We think of like a notorious scene of a gang rape years ago. So, Thomas O'Neill was the leader of that gang. He was gone on to be a serious criminal. And it's just...
I'm sure it's a beautiful spot for a walk, and that was a long time ago.
We shouldn't be constantly knocking Limerick and the beauty spots around it.
So she gets the day out, and she is accompanied at all times, or is she free to do her own thing?
No, she would be accompanied. They're escorted visits.
And like if she was in an open prison, that wouldn't be the case?
If she was in an open prison, you're free to come and go during the day,
and they're allowed to go home at weekends and stuff like that. I think coming towards
some of them can be. Yeah, it depends. It's often
depends
the
on
other
their
way
behaviour.
Around. They might be let out during the week and then back into prison at the weekends, or vice versa, depending on if someone has addiction problems, or if there's still an element of chaos in their life or whatever. And which we know was a big issue with the Mulhalls. They lived incredibly chaotic lives with serious addiction issues. I mean, in fairness, Linda, since her release, we haven't heard a peep. I know Eugene, our colleague, approached her at one stage, and she didn't want to talk about it at the time. But was living a pretty normal life down in County Kildare, last we heard of. So I mean, it can be done, I guess.
So were they risk assessed? Sort of a killer, a murderer coming up towards a time where they'd be looking for parole, or they risk assessed to see, what the actual crime was? I mean, their crime mean, their mother's partner, Farah Swaleh Noor, was notoriously violent towards women. They had been out during the day in town. They'd met their mother and they'd all taken drugs and copious amount of alcohol together. They'd gone back to the house. And the narrative was that he had sort of come on to Linda, and Linda and her sister Charlotte had sort of attacked him. And then after his death, they had panicked and cut him up in the bathroom of a small house in Richmond Cottages and dumped his body parts in the canal, and his head was transported on a bus in a backpack and buried in a field in Tala. But all of that is
never found.
And if that's, of course, how they got the name, the Scissor Sisters. The case was pretty sensational because when the remains of Farah Swaleh Noor were initially found in the canal, he couldn't be identified. And the biggest part at the start of that murder investigation was to find out who he was. I think there was bone experts brought in. Then they realised that his origins were from Africa, so they had to get translators and try and reach out into the African population to see if they could find somebody missing. And I think eventually he was identified because of a jersey. He was wearing a sports jersey that somebody had recognised him that day in town, and the focus of the investigation went on to Richmond Cottages, where he had been living with Kathleen Mulhall, and the events of the day leading up to the murder. But you know, as a crime, taking away all that gruesome dismemberment and everything, they were feeling under threat from somebody, and they were trying to sort of save their mother from this individual. So is that taken on board, that this wasn't a random as such act of violence as regards risk threat? Is like, would somebody like Charlotte Mulhall be a risk to the public in general?
Well, that's I suppose the balancing act that the authorities or probation officers take, and I suppose you'd have to look at someone's behaviour like in prison. So I mean, we all know that prisoners can get hold of drugs and homemade hooch, or even get proper alcohol smuggled in. So I mean, if somebody is still drinking and using drugs in prison and causing trouble, you could say, yeah, they're definitely still a risk. And
if that was linked to the original crime they're convicted of, that kind of drug taking and alcohol use.
Yeah, and there's all that kind of, how if someone's taken part in, educational programs, not necessarily doing the Leaving Cert or doing an Open University degree or anything like that, but, anything that kind of shows that, they've gained a greater insight into life, into, what they have done. But having said that, I mean, some people are good at playing the game. Like we've seen that in the past with some prisoners. I mean, Charlotte Mulhall, on the face of it, you would kind of say, she served a long time when you consider that there was an argument of self-defense, which the jury didn't, I suppose, accept at the time. She did lose appeals. Like, initially her behaviour in prison over the years, well, not initially, but over the years, like her behaviour in prison hasn't always been great. Like in a sense that, not that she was necessarily attacking other prisoners or anything like that, but there was, infamously, a jokey picture that she put up with another male prisoner, and it was a knife being used to cut a birthday cake. So, and she was holding it up to his throat. So, okay, that was, I suppose, very dark humour, in bad taste and all the rest. But it landed her in big trouble. And over different times, then, like she's been working as a beautician. There was one case where it was alleged she was having an inappropriate relationship with a member of staff. This is all said in the High Court in a case. And she was saying, look, she was sitting on this person because she was giving them a beauty treatment, and that was the way they were doing it or whatever, which is fair enough. And she was at the time, this is I think in 2021, it's not too long ago.
And why was she up in court at that stage? Was it some disciplinary?
She wanted, it was a case they were taking, she wanted her transfer to Limerick from the Doka Centre in Mountjoy Prison. She wanted that reversed. She wanted to go back because she felt she was separated from family members. There's people that were, it was much more difficult for them to go see her in Limerick. And plus, like she was close to the dog that she had in prison. There was a prison dog. And that she was sad and lonely as a result. But like she does seem to have kind of settled down in Limerick now. It'd be a much smaller prison. It's a brand new wing there, which opened, took a while, but it did open. So, I mean, she's in a brand new women's wing in Limerick Prison. There's only two other lifers in that, two other female lifers in there as well.
And who are they?
So it's a smaller... They would be Rose Lynch, if you remember, Tiny Lynch's daughter. She's serving life for the 2011 murder of David Darcy. So that was done on behalf of the Continuity IRA, wasn't it? The CIRA?
Yeah, and she had a list in her handbag of members that she was going to kill. That was a shooting, I think, but the family of the victim would have said that they got the wrong man, that he had nothing to do with what they said that they were going for him for. He had nothing to do with subversive activity, they said. Rose Lynch was the daughter of Tiny Joe Lynch, maybe that's the way around it was.
And don't forget, he got a 6.5 year sentence with 3 suspended in 2020. So he should be out now as well himself. But that was in Northern Ireland. He was going to serve that. So I presume he is out at this stage and back visiting.
Yeah,
Rose.
he was caught up in Northern Ireland on some bugging. They were planning. It was a continuity
it was in
IRA
Uri or something. We were talking about trying to get weapons or something.
It was
like
when
that.
she was jailed at the time in 2011. Is it? Gosh, it doesn't feel that long ago. I actually interviewed him down in Limerick outside his house in...
I remember that photograph of you towering over him, and that's why he's called Tiny Lynch, I guess.
Ballinacurra. I think I was wearing runners actually as well, but anyway, Ballinacurra Weston. But I was sort of asking him and about her and his thoughts on his daughter going to prison to serve life, and he was proud of her. He called her staunch and said she was, fighting the cause. He didn't seem to think there was anything wrong with giving up your liberty for the rest of your days. And Rose Lynch, I think, was a mother of a number of children. I think she could have been a grandmother at that stage as well.
And sorry, just to make the point, seeing as I mentioned David Darcy's name, that a completely innocent man who had nothing to do with any kind of criminality or dissident activity.
Yeah.
And so it was just important to make that point.
Yeah.
Because it was an absolutely stupid, pointless murder, and there was talk about Rose was besotted with another man.
That's right.
That kind of led her down this track, and really has shown no remorse to some extent.
And I think he was a bread man or something, and they had gathered some intelligence with the Continuity IRA, which are a chaotic organisation anyway. And they had gathered intelligence that he was supposed to be involved in certain activity, that they were going to target him. But the intelligence was simply wrong.
Or the wrong person had been identified by whoever was
totally wrong,
gathering the intelligence for the.
But of course, they were sticking to it. You know what I mean? There was no question that they got anything wrong, even though it was black and white that they had. They were sticking to it, and that was part of the reason I interviewed Tiny Joe Lynch at the time, to ask him, did they accept that they got the wrong man? They'd killed an innocent man, but he wouldn't. Yeah,
and I think she has, as far as I know, stuck to her guns. I mean, she was actually friendly with Lisa Smith, if you remember, the ISIS former member of the Defence Forces, when she was doing her what did she get? She got about 2 years or 18 months. So she spent some of that in Limerick prison as well. They got on well together,
I think nice. Rose Lynch was sort of somebody who went into teaching, and she has actually appeared to have been sort of a useful prisoner, if you know what I mean, and rehabilitated, although she has never shown remorse for her crime. And she has sort of never, accepted that she killed an innocent man and took him away from the family. But I think she has gone into education. She's possibly done degrees. And you can see why those sort of people maybe come together like-minded. They're sort of looking for something, seeking something, or something to drive them.
And look, I mean, it's easier to do time if you believe you were right.
Is Lisa Smith out now?
No, she's out ages ago, yeah. It was a relatively short sentence compared to the lifers,
Absolutely.
So, I mean, but the other lifer then, like you just mentioned, the 3 that I know of in Limerick at the minute is Karen Harrington, who went in I think she killed her daughter Santina Cawley in 2019, and that was a pretty horrific case. The child was battered to death, and she tried to blame the husband.
Right.
And there was a pretty, there was very graphic evidence in court and all the rest.
What age was the child?
So she was 2 years of age, a very young child. So it was pretty horrific. That was at the apartment in their own home in Bornabrina Road in Cork. Sorry, in Boreen Manor Road in Cork in 2019. So she appealed that in 2024. Then her appeal was turned down. Like the child's father had been in a relationship with Karen Harrington, and he had left the child in her apartment. And this happened. The child had something like 53 separate injuries, and the state pathologist said that the injuries couldn't have been accidental, such as the number and the fact they were all over the child's body. So it wasn't like she could argue that she fell downstairs or fell out of a bed or anything like that. And a lot of it hinged on CCTV to show that the husband, because she tried to blame the father of the child. Sorry, not the husband, her boyfriend
Partner,
at the time. So it was a pretty horrible crime. So I mean, it just shows you the kind of the mix. I mean, like you have people like Charlotte Mulhall, where the aftermath was gruesome, but initially it was this. I suppose self-defense,
an emotional
element
moment
to it,
and
then probably went too far. Rose Lynch, then, who was very much a committed political killer in her head, anyway. And then you have somebody again. I suppose Harrington, like Mulhall, would have a chaotic lifestyle, but committed a horrific murder against a child. And you have others then, like there's Rita O'Driscoll. She's in since I think around 2018. She killed her ex-husband Timmy Foley, and that again was kind of a boozy madness thing in I think it was in Cork, and it was witnessed by his brother Jason, and she stabbed him 28 times. It was her ex-husband, and she would have argued that she was trying to, it was a domestic violence. His family say absolutely not. That she was a dangerous woman, and they never want to see her get
she was driven to it by years of domestic
So there's two
violence.
sides. I think there's even been some members of her family, I think, have over time have tried to start a little campaign, or a campaign rather, to try and portray her as that she was somebody who was fighting against being victimized, but that's firmly rejected by the victim's family and also the jury as well.
Well, 28 stab wounds.
Yeah. You have some strange, like Sabrina Cummins. I remember writing about this before, and her brother Kenneth. They killed a guy called Thomas Horn. He was a 63-year-old vulnerable man with special needs, and they thought he had money in his house in Ringsend and tortured him, strangled him. I think they forced him to drink kind of whatever cleaning fluids and this kind of stuff, and left him for dead. And €50 was stolen. So that's what that was over. Again, trying to drink and drug fueled. Like, keep going through the list of them.
Who's Catherine O'Connor?
Catherine O'Connor. Do you remember the picture of the lady with the swastika tattooed on her face? That's
yes.
Catherine O'Connor. So that was a case in Bandon where they killed a man called Jonathan Duke. There was a co-accused, Cyprian Grozzavu, who was her boyfriend at the time. And he helped dump the body off the balcony into the river. Then the next day, one of her exes, I think, kind of became aware of what had happened. So he was killed as well. So she was done for both murders. Grozzavu was done for one. He was acquitted on one of the murders, but he was done for helping in the other one. So she was very much seen as
was that
as the
a sort of a drink fueled situation again?
Crazy drink fueled. It was a broken mug, I think, was used to stab them. They had apparently were heard laughing. They managed to miss throwing the body out into the river. They managed to miss, and it landed on a walkway, and they had to go down and tumble it into the river again. So I mean, it's horrible stuff, really. Tanya Doyle from Tala killed her husband Paul in 2019. There was evidence. I remember there was
2009, was it?
Yeah, 2009. Sorry. Yeah, and there was a 999 call, and he was heard basically saying, "My wife is stabbing me." So he again suffered multiple stab wounds. I think I wrote down the number here, 68 times.
Right.
Unusually enough, I actually had met Tanya Doyle because she had rung in to this is before the murder. She had rung in claiming that she wanted to kind of hand over details of a kind of a vice operation, that was going to expose a pimp. And it didn't go too far. It struck me as extremely eccentric, if not completely crazy,
right?
To be honest. And I can't remember the exact details, but it did come out then that she was certainly, she's been portrayed as having worked as a prostitute and having run a brothel herself. And she more or less said, nothing to do with the husband. He had nothing to do with any of this, and that she very much wanted she wanted a new start and wanted her share of whatever money she was going to get from his death. And she said as much to the guards. So she's one of those as well.
And did she try to cover up that murder? Was she kind of caught red-handed with it?
No, I think she was pretty much caught red-handed because I think the police arrived on the scene. The guards arrived on the scene pretty quick because he didn't die immediately. Obviously, he was able to make the call, or he was in the process of being killed when he was making the call. And they got him, and she was arrested at the scene, pretty much. And she made admissions as well. Whether she made them in the formal interview, she made them certainly at the scene.
It's like these people, they go to prison and we forget about them, and they could be it's such big stories behind them. Actually, who's Greta Dudko?
So Greta Dudko is, she was a nurse and she was sentenced to life. She killed her mother on a Christmas Eve. And this was, I think, in 2012. And I think she'd been suffering from mental illness after breaking up for her husband. And I think I do remember from one of the things about the case was that she broke up with her partner and moved back in, or ended up living with her mother because of this, because she thought he had been cheating on her. And I think she'd been she had been forced to take time off work, or she took time off work because she'd been found to be drunk, working as a nurse. So she was obviously coping very badly with this. And he actually admitted then in court that, yes, she was right. He had been playing offside, whatever, or having an
common
affair
thread with the women, isn't there?
A little bit. It's drink and
drink
whatever.
And being, going for ex-partners or partners, domestic, except of course for Regina Keogh, who is probably the only female serving life for a gangland murder.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose it's in one sense she's a step below Rose Lynch, who was thought to have pulled the trigger and done the actual killing herself. Regina Keogh, I suppose, she was much more removed. That she helped the killers get an apartment so they could watch and wait.
I have to say, I feel sorry for Regina Keogh. All right, I'm going to say that because I actually sat through. So her brother is Johnny Keogh, who's sort of a 9LA hitman who took on the job to kill Gareth Hutch for money at the beginning of the Kinahan-Hutch feud. And Regina Keogh, his sister, was living in Avondale House, which was where Gareth Hutch was trying to get a transfer from because he felt threatened and he had a young child and he'd actually applied to be moved. Regina Keogh let her apartment be used by Johnny Keogh and others who used it as a lookout.
She persuaded a friend to let them use it.
Oh, she persuaded a friend. That was her role.
Yeah. In that kind of a flat complex
and
there.
From memory, it was for money. And she was, the only charge that she was put up on was murder. And at the time, I think it was before some of the other charges that we see now coming in, conspiracies and all those were being either used or were there. It was, I remember actually being in the court and she was Justice Tony Hunt, found her guilty and he was sentencing her to the mandatory life term. And he was doing so because it was his only option. But you could hear from him that, there was no other charge put against her and there could be no other charge, that literally this was the only charge that could be put against her. She facilitated murder. She didn't, I suppose, pull the trigger. I don't know why I feel a little bit sorry for her. I think because she's a woman. So, that's wrong. But she was a mother of 5. I think she had addiction issues But
the conviction has been tested.
It has,
her appeal was rejected and it went to the Supreme Court, who basically refused to hear it. They said there wasn't any grounds for, for them to consider any more. And
look, Gareth Hutch is a huge loss to his family and his young son. And I don't mean that in a way to insult the victim in the case. It was just, I felt she was lured in by the brother who was in it for money. And, he had been very easily bought up by the Kinahan mob. He had been, he was going to do as many murders as he could to make as much money as he could. And he sort of brought her into his world. And, there she is serving life, the two of them. And their other brother, of course, was it Michael Keogh, was killed during the feud. He was the only sort of non-Hutch faction member killed during that feud.
That's right, yeah. He was
murdered in the basement of a car park. Anyway, she's a long way to go with that, doesn't she? And obviously she was party to that murder. Without her sorting out that lookout, that murder probably couldn't have occurred the way it did that day.
I mean, it's possibly because of what might be regarded as her lesser role in the killing, but it's still a serious role in the killing.
Of course.
That would be considered by, a parole board at some stage. The system has changed, and I think there has been a delay in some of these. So I imagine that she would be considered for release sooner than
the brother.
Because of that. And the fact that, she's a mother of 5 and, whether or not she's been able to maintain relationships with her family, all that's taken into account. But
the fallout there, like, I mean, you just even take that one murder, like, as given that we're talking about these things, the fallout for so many people from that one murder, obviously for the Keogh family, Johnny Keogh and Regina Keogh, the siblings who are in prison for life, for Gareth Hutch, for his child that'll grow up without a father, for his brothers, his sisters, his father, Johnny. Hutch subsequently died in tragic circumstances, and I think that the family would pretty much blame it on the stress of what had gone on. His other brother, Jonathan Hutch, survived an assassination attempt. The fallout was just from that one moment. And of course, the video of that murder, if you remember, was released somehow at the time on social media, and there was grainy footage of the killers going up behind him. And it was just like watching a movie. You wanted to shout at him, to duck, to run, you know. And of course, they were in it for the fee they were getting.
Yeah, look, I mean, actions have consequences, and sometimes the smallest action can lead to, wider
But the ripple effect of that, I mean, okay, in the moment, of course, and the grief and the tragedy for Gareth Hutch's family, and the ongoing grief and tragedy and loss for them, but the next generation down as well, and on both sides.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's. I suppose, I mean, Gareth Hutch isn't coming back, but Regina Keogh is going to return to her family someday.
Sure.
And I suppose that's the difference.
That is the difference,
and they can, Gareth Hutch's family are going to a grave or whatever memorial they have, whereas, Regina Keogh's family can go and see her in prison. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not the same. I don't think it really compares. Because there's always hope that someone's going to get out and at some point in your life you'll be able to resume your life. I mean, that's never going to happen for Gareth Hutch.
It's just the generational effects of it. The children growing up without the parents, how they will react themselves in relationships and parenting in their communities. And that would just stay with you. I mean, if that was something that was way back in your family, a great-grandfather even, it would still have an effect on you.
I imagine it would,
that they had been murdered in that way and for those reasons.
Yeah, and you can see why people would change their names by deed poll and things like that. If you're from particular towns or cities or different parts of Ireland and there's a particular name in an area that's associated with some, horrific tragedy or murder or nasty crime, you're gonna try and put some distance between it and you and your children and so on. So I mean, that's nothing new in that sense.
No, but she is just an unusual character in that she's there in relation to a gangland crime, which is usually not a domestic. It's a financial. It's a feud within an organised crime groupings.
You see that even with the kind of with the male lifers that I kind of a while back I went through some of it and I was coming up with my own sort of terminology like wife killer and stuff like that, and a boozy attack, these kind of one punch or these fights and stupid stuff that happens outside a pub at midnight because whatever, like drugs, drink and room temperature IQ all meet up at the same unfortunate moment for somebody, and well over half of them would be in that grouping, like just stupid stuff that went on, like that shouldn't have happened. Despite, the X amount of gangland killers, they're not overly, there's not that many compared to the rest of the 300 and whatever male lifers. But, a lot of it is not premeditated. I mean, you can look at, say, if you compare, say, Charlotte Mulhall and Regina Keogh, Regina Keogh probably had more chances to step off the spiral of bad decision making, whereas Charlotte Mulhall, it was all in a moment to some extent. And
Regina Keogh, of course, had that whole night to stop that. Whenever they went into that apartment, she knew what was going to happen the next day. And
it's possible if Charlotte Mulhall hadn't been as under the influence of drink or drugs, might have at some point stopped the attack, called an ambulance and explained to the guards what happened, and they might have been treated more sympathetically. So, but I mean, it's all kind of what ifs. But I mean, it's hard to know, are women treated differently? I mean, the idea that there isn't kind of a version of an open prison for women, which I imagine, you could do easy in a way, because it would probably just need to be a 4-bedroom house somewhere.
Well, probably, yeah. It's funny that they haven't challenged that isn't available for them in the same way as it is. It sounds a little bit unequal opportunities there for female prisoners. While we have called out all the lifers, we should probably not forget Paula Farrell. the last of them? Because we've mentioned Marta Herda, which I think you said she's gone to.
She's serving her time now in Poland. Yeah. Paula Farrell, what thing was it? Is it Dundalk or she stabbed her partner Wayne Quillen as a New Year's Eve. Was two of them on New Year's Eve now, wasn't it? Yeah. So again, that would have been, I presume,
Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve are dangerous nights, obviously.
Well, it's drink and emotion, you know. And again, I think there was a bit of an attempt here in this case to try and show that, you know, suggesting that she was somehow the victim of violence. Again, that was kind of roundly rejected by the victim's family and also by the jury. And she's been out a couple of times on release, which I think some people in the area were a bit surprised, given the nature of the attack. I mean, Wayne McQuillan, by all accounts, is a pretty enough kind of quiet guy. Like she had lied and she falsely claimed that he had tried to strangle her.
And it's only 2018 she was convicted, yeah?
Yeah.
And she's already been out 6 years in.
She stabbed him 4 times in the neck and he died as a result of that. But, you know, it's one of those, again, you know, it's one of those kind of killings that probably shouldn't have happened.
When the Doka Centre opened, which probably would have been in the late 1990s, up until then, weren't the women housed in St. Patrick's Institution or somewhere like that? There was no specific women's prison. But the Doka Centre opened under John Lonergan, the then governor, and they made it very humane for women. The Dokas was kind of like, you know, at the time it was the most modern facility in Europe. And the women kind of almost had an apartment to themselves with an ensuite bathroom. Their children were allowed to come in to the prison to see them, which I think was a first. If they were pregnant or if they had babies, they were allowed to keep the child with them until they were about 1 or 18 months or thereabouts.
It's fairly short, but yeah, they are, yeah.
Yeah. And there was other sort of humanitarian kind of stuff brought in there. I'm sure it's all got worn now, the Dokas, and isn't probably as modern as other facilities around Europe.
The vast majority of women in the Doka Centre are people with addiction problems, and they're in there for petty crimes, and a lot of them are in there constantly. You know, they're serving short sentences. Yeah. I mean, there was a documentary there not so long ago, and that was quite apparent. You know, that anyone kind of serving longer terms, like, they seem to kind of settle in and get into a routine. And, you know, unfortunately for some people, their release date comes too soon. They haven't been able to address whatever problems they have, and they end up back in again. I mean, there's been so many of those. I mean, just, you know, chronic addicts who just are constantly
in and out, forced
to steal and stuff like that.
The Charlotte Mulhall must be the most sort of infamous female prisoner now in the system, because of course Catherine Nevin would have held that torch beforehand, before her death. But
thanks to her different outfit for every day of her trial, if you remember that.
That Black Widow, you know, moniker that she held as well.
It's a script, a Hollywood script, isn't it? You know, hiring a killer or pretending to, or whatever. We don't really know. Did she do it, or was there a hired killer?
To kill her gentleman husband, the publican, Tom Nevin. But I wonder how Charlotte Mulhall feels about that.
I'd say she could write enough to feel aggrieved that she spent so long, you know. But, you know, I suppose we don't know the ins and outs of absolutely everything. And it's quite possible that, you know, with various attempts of you know, trying to get her outside worlds, you know, things might fall back again. We did a story, I think, in March 21 or 20, like during lockdown. And she was brought out to meet people in I think it was Clondalkin, family members or something like that. And then again, that was all part of, you know, a kind of a step down thing to eventually see her being released. So, I mean, that's been going on like for the last couple of years, for at least 4 or 5 years now.
Imagine it's nearly 2 decades since that murder.
Just as well, ladies aren't killing as many.
Yeah, it's just hard to believe it's that long. Feels like yesterday. Okay, Eamon, well, thank you for all that.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.